It was a cold Thanksgiving Eve in the 1880s, the kind of night that made every sound sharper and the dark seem heavier. The ranch stood isolated, a dot on the vast, endless stretch of land. Inside, the warmth of the fire flickered against the walls, casting long shadows across an empty table, set for ghosts. Ion Brennan had been alone for 3 years now. Since his wife, Mary, and son, James, had passed, he'd kept the tradition of Thanksgiving, though this year he wasn't sure why. His house was silent, save for the occasional groan of the wind. Outside, the stillness was broken by a faint sound, a knock. It was hesitant at first, almost as if the knocker themselves wasn't sure they should be there. Ion stiffened, rifle close by, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the door. A rancher out here, alone in these mountains, didn't get many visitors, and those who came usually had some business. He hesitated, his hand resting on the rifle, before he stood up and walked to the door. He opened it to find a woman standing there, her face drawn and pale, with 3 children clinging to her like they were afraid to let go. The woman looked tired, worn out in a way that made Ion's heart twist. She looked as if she'd been walking for days, and the way her eyes darted nervously to the shadows spoke of something far more urgent than just a desire to be somewhere safe. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice a whisper carried by the cold wind. "We've been traveling, we've nowhere else to go." Ion studied her for a long moment. His instincts kicked in. She was a stranger, yes, but there was something in her voice, something in her eyes that made him pause. The children were skinny, their faces pinched with hunger, and the smallest one, a baby, was burning with fever. Ion could see the desperation in her eyes, something raw and real, like the kind of fear that only came when there was nowhere left to run. "You don't have to apologize," Ion said gruffly. His voice was rough and used to speaking to strangers, but he had a protective instinct that no amount of loneliness could extinguish. Come in, get out of the cold." The woman's relief was almost palpable as she stepped over the threshold, pulling the children inside with her. Ion stepped aside to let them in, his eyes lingering on the baby, who was burning with fever. The child's thin arms were limp in her mother's arms, and her chest heaved with shallow breaths. "Sit by the fire," Ion told her as he closed the door. His eyes flickered to the children. Daniel, the oldest at 10, was doing his best to hold himself together. He was trying to be strong for the others, but his face was drawn, and Ion could see the worry in his eyes. Sarah, who was 7, hadn't spoken in days, and her silence seemed like a reflection of the sadness that hung in the air. And then there was the baby, Lily, only 18 months old, sick with something Ion couldn't put his finger on, but he knew it was serious. "I've got food," Ion said, trying to sound reassuring as he moved toward the table. It wasn't much: dried meats, a few potatoes, some bread he'd baked earlier in the week. It wasn't much, but it was something. The children barely waited before they sat down, their eyes wide as they devoured what little was placed before them. They ate as if it was the first food they'd seen in days, their hunger sharp and undeniable. Isabella, the woman, looked on with a mixture of guilt and relief, her hands trembling as she placed her baby down beside her on a chair. Ion watched them for a moment, his heart softening. He could see how much they needed this. Not just food, but a moment of safety. He could tell the woman, Isabella, had been through hell to get here. She didn't look at him with gratitude yet, but with a kind of wariness that came from years of not trusting anyone, from running without knowing where the next step would land her. But as the children ate, a tiny bit of color returned to their cheeks, and Isabella finally let out a breath she didn't even realize she was holding. "This is enough," Isabella murmured. "Thank you." Ion nodded, his eyes lingering on her for just a second longer than necessary. Something wasn't right. He could feel it. This wasn't just some woman passing through. The way her hands shook, the way she glanced nervously out the window, he knew they were running from something. From someone. But he didn't ask her yet. Not now. He couldn't. Not while the children were safe. Not while they were all sitting here, trying to feel human again. Isabella looked at him, her eyes full of silent thanks. Then her voice broke the silence again, soft, almost fragile. We've been running for 3 days. Silas Hartwell, he's been chasing us. He's my brother-in-law. I can't go back. Ion's eyes narrowed. He didn't know the name, but there was something in her voice that said it all. This wasn't just family trouble. It was something far darker, far more dangerous. And the way she looked at him, the way she hesitated before she spoke, Ion had been around long enough to know when someone was hiding the truth. Just then, as if on cue, a shadow passed the window. Ion's instincts flared. He stood, his hand moving toward the rifle resting by the door, his eyes darting to the fresh tracks in the snow outside. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching. "Get the children to the cellar," Ion said, his voice firm. "Now." Isabella's eyes widened in panic. "What? Why? Don't ask questions. Just do it," Ion ordered, his voice cold, his hand steady on the rifle. He wasn't sure who was out there, but he was sure of one thing. They weren't here to make friends. Isabella nodded, fear flashing across her face. She gathered her children quickly, whispering to them as she led them to the cellar door. Ion stood by the window, rifle in hand, waiting. He could feel it in his bones. They were no longer alone. And as Isabella closed the cellar door behind her, Ion stepped outside, his boots crunching in the snow. Fresh tracks circled his property, tracks that weren't there an hour ago. Someone knew they were here. His hand tightened on the rifle, and he turned back to the house. The reckoning was coming. Isabella sat silently by the fire, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes staring into the flickering flames as the warmth of the room seemed to hold her in a fragile peace. The children were asleep. Daniel curled up beside her, his small body still shivering despite the warmth. Sarah tucked under a blanket with her hands clutched tightly around her knees, and Lily lay in her arms, feverish but finally quiet after days of pain. Ion stood by the window, watching the darkness outside as the wind howled across the barren landscape, feeling the weight of his own solitude. The house was small, but it had always been enough for him. Yet now, with these strangers under his roof, it felt more like a home than it ever had before. As the wind outside grew louder, he turned away from the window and faced Isabella, who was still lost in her thoughts. He could tell she was holding something back, a truth she hadn't yet shared, but he didn't press her. Instead, he moved toward the stove, checking the fire, stoking it with some more wood. "You're safe here," he said quietly, his words meant to reassure both her and himself, but there was a part of him that remained on edge. Isabella's eyes flickered up at him, and for a moment, they just looked at each other in silence. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. "I'm not sure how to repay you," she said softly, her voice strained, as if the words were not just for him, but for herself, a confession she had been holding in for far too long. "You've already done so much." She trailed off, her voice breaking as she looked down at Lily, her hand gently brushing the baby's fevered brow. Ion could see the pain in her eyes, the exhaustion that seemed to seep from every part of her. But there was something else too, a deep, unshakable fear. It wasn't just the hunger or the cold. It was something much darker, a fear that had driven her to run across this vast, unforgiving land with nothing but her children and the clothes on her back. She had come here looking for refuge, but Ion could sense that the danger she had fled from wasn't over yet. He knew the kind of fear that came from running. It was a different kind of fear, one that gnawed at your bones and never let you go. "You don't need to repay me," Ion said, his voice quiet, almost to himself, but she heard him. "What you need is to rest. Get your children settled." He glanced at the cellar door, where he had hidden them just moments ago, knowing that the safety of his home was an illusion, one that could be shattered in an instant. The fire crackled in the hearth, its light dancing across the walls, and for a moment, Ayan felt the familiar sting of loneliness that had haunted him since his own wife's death. But now it was different. Now he saw the children sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, and he saw Isabella, her face drawn but relieved. "We won't stay long," Isabella said after a while, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll leave as soon as Lily's well. I just need a few days. I'm not running from just anyone." She stopped, her hands shaking as she smoothed Lily's hair. "Silas, my brother-in-law, he's the one after us." Ayan's eyes narrowed, a cold recognition settling in his chest. Silas Hartwell. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. "He's a man I wish I could forget. My husband's brother. He's the one who sent me away, told me I wasn't fit to care for my children. He wants them back. He has the papers, the so-called legal documents, saying I'm unfit." Isabella's voice wavered, her eyes flicking toward the cellar door. "But it's a lie. He's not interested in legal rights. He wants them because they're mine. They're his inheritance." Ayan didn't respond at first, letting her words sink in. He could tell she wasn't telling the whole story, that there was more beneath the surface, but he didn't push her for more. Not yet. Instead, he offered a simple truth. "You're safe here, Isabella. I'll protect you." It was a promise he had no idea how he would keep, but it felt right to say. He looked out the window again, the moon casting a pale light across the land, and his thoughts turned toward the tracks he had seen earlier. They were fresh, far too fresh. Whoever had followed them was close. He could feel it in his gut. They weren't safe here. Not yet. As if on cue, there was a sudden sound outside. A hoofbeat, faint at first, then louder, followed by the sound of another. Ayan's heart skipped a beat, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle by the door. Isabella looked up at him, her eyes wide. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. Ayan didn't answer immediately. He stood still for a moment, his senses straining to catch every sound, every movement in the darkness. "Someone's out there," he finally said. "You need to get the children to the cellar. Now." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. "What's happening? Who?" "Get them to the cellar. Quickly." Ayan's voice was sharp now. No room for argument. Isabella hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the room, but she didn't argue. She stood and went to the children, waking them gently, her hands shaking as she pulled them close to her. Ayan could hear them murmuring, the little ones still half asleep, unaware of the danger outside. As Isabella ushered them into the cellar, Ayan moved to the door, checking the rifle again, making sure it was loaded and ready. He stepped outside, his breath visible in the cold night air. The tracks outside were still fresh, but now there were more of them, circling his property, coming closer. He stepped carefully, keeping low, listening for any sign of movement. His heart was pounding in his chest, the weight of what was coming pressing down on him like a storm cloud. Someone was watching. Someone was hunting them. He could feel it in his bones. As he turned back toward the house, he saw Isabella standing in the doorway, her face pale but determined. He gave her a brief nod, and she stepped back inside, closing the door quietly behind her. The knock had come. The storm was here, and Ayan knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before the reckoning would begin. As the wind howled outside, he checked his rifle once more and stepped back in the shadows, ready for whatever came next. This wasn't over yet. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a soft glow across the ranch as the chill of the night slowly faded into the warmth of a new day. Inside the house, a quiet peace had settled, a sense of safety that Isabella had not known in days. The fire still crackled in the hearth, sending light dancing across the walls, but there was no longer the desperate tension that had filled the room the night before. The children were still asleep, their small bodies curled up in blankets, their faces no longer pinched with hunger or fear. For the first time in what felt like forever, they had slept soundly, their bellies full, their minds at ease. Isabella looked down at baby Lily, who was still sleeping in her arms, her fever finally breaking. She ran a hand over the child's damp forehead, relief flooding her chest as she felt the warmth of the baby's skin return to normal. It was a small victory, but in that moment, it felt like a lifeline. She gently shifted Lily to the side and looked up, catching Ayan's gaze from across the room. He stood by the window, his eyes scanning the land outside, ever watchful. But something had changed in him, too. There was a softness in his expression, a quiet acceptance in the way he moved, as if the weight of the world had lifted, if only for a brief moment. Isabella pushed herself to her feet and walked toward him, her steps slow but steady. "The children, they're asleep," she said softly, almost as if afraid to break the peace that had settled in the room. Ayan turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. He nodded, but his face remained unreadable. "Good. They need rest," he replied, his voice rough from disuse. He turned back to the window, his eyes narrowing as he looked out at the fields beyond. Isabella followed his gaze, her chest tightening as she thought of the danger that still loomed over them. The storm that had followed them here hadn't passed, and no amount of food or rest would change that. She wasn't foolish enough to think they were safe just because they had found a warm meal and a roof over their heads. But she was trying, for the first time in days, to let herself believe in the possibility of safety, if only for her children. She glanced back at the table, noticing the meager breakfast that had been prepared, a few simple eggs, some bread, and coffee. To Ayan, it probably seemed like nothing, something quickly thrown together without much thought, but to her and her children, it was everything. It was the first real meal they had in days, the first moment of normalcy since they had begun their desperate flight. She had tried to get away, to save herself and her children from Silas's grip, but she had never imagined that it would be like this, running across endless plains, always looking over her shoulder, never knowing who she could trust. And yet, here they were. She looked at Ayan again, seeing the same quiet strength in him that had drawn her in when they first met. His eyes were filled with something she couldn't quite name, but in that moment, it wasn't pity or concern. It was understanding. They were both carrying their own burdens, their own ghosts, but somehow, here in this house, they had found a brief reprieve. Ayan finally broke the silence, his voice low as he spoke, his words carefully chosen. "You know, I've never had a proper Thanksgiving. Not since Mary and James died." He paused for a moment, as if the words were difficult to say. "I guess I thought I didn't need to celebrate. What's there to be thankful for, really?" Isabella looked at him, her heart heavy with understanding. "You don't have to have a big celebration to feel thankful," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's the small things that matter most." Ayan's gaze softened as he looked at her, and for a moment, the weight of his sorrow seemed to lift, just enough for her to see the man beneath the hardened exterior. She could see the scars he carried, the ones that hadn't healed, the ones he kept hidden beneath layers of silence. But in that moment, she also saw the quiet strength he had shown, the way he had stepped in without hesitation, protecting her and her children when he didn't have to. That was something to be thankful for. Ayan looked down at his hands, his fingers twitching slightly as if he didn't quite know what to do with himself. "I don't know how to do this," he said, his voice quieter now. "How to make things right, how to give them, how to give you what you need." Isabella's heart ached as she stepped closer, her hand resting on his arm. "You've already done more than enough," she said softly. "You've given us safety, a place to rest. I don't know where we'd be without you." Ayan turned to face her, his expression more open now than it had been before. "You don't have to stay, you know," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. "I won't make you. I understand if you want to leave as soon as Lily's better." Isabella shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'm not going anywhere. Not yet." The words felt good to say, almost as if she was finally allowing herself to believe that there could be more to life than running, that there could be a chance for something good to come from all of this pain. Just then, Daniel stirred from the corner of the room, his eyes opening slowly as he blinked against the morning light. "Ma," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. Isabella's heart softened at the sound of his voice. "I'm here, Daniel," she said, her voice gentle. Daniel rubbed his eyes and sat up slowly, looking around the room. His eyes fell on Ayan, and for a moment, he looked at him with curiosity. "Are you staying?" Daniel asked, his voice small but hopeful. Ayan looked at the boy, his expression softening. "I'm staying," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I'm here to keep you all safe." Daniel nodded, a small smile forming on his face. "Okay," he said, settling back down against the couch. Isabella watched him, her heart full as she saw the faintest glimmer of hope in her son's eyes. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe that there could be something better waiting for them. She turned back to Ayan, meeting his gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Ayan gave a small nod, his lips curving into a faint smile. "You're welcome," he replied, but his eyes quickly darted toward the window again, his senses alert. He knew they couldn't let their guard down completely. There was still danger lurking out there, just beyond the horizon. Isabella followed his gaze, her heart sinking slightly. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. Ayan didn't answer right away. He just watched the horizon, his eyes scanning the land, listening to the sounds of the wind. Then he turned back to her, his face serious. "I don't know," he said slowly, "but something doesn't feel right. We need to stay vigilant." Isabella nodded, her heart tightening with unease. The storm was far from over, and she knew, deep down, that their struggle was just beginning. But for now, as she looked at her children, safe, warm, and for the moment at peace, she allowed herself to believe that they had a chance. A small one, but a chance nonetheless. The peace was fragile, but it was enough. And for now, it was all she needed. The quiet of the morning was shattered by the sound of hooves approaching, the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves against the earth cutting through the peaceful hum of nature. Ayan stood at the window, his eyes narrowing as he saw the riders coming from the distance, their figures becoming clearer with every passing second. His pulse quickened as he recognized the shape of the man at the front, a man he never wanted to see again. Silas Hartwell. The name sent a cold chill down Ayan's spine, the history between them far from forgotten. Ayan had known Silas from long before the death of his wife and son, knew the kind of man he was: cold, calculating, and ruthless. He was not a man you could reason with, not a man you could trust. His entire life had been about gaining control, whether it was over land, people, or wealth. Ayan turned away from the window, moving toward the rifle by the door. Isabella looked up from where she was sitting by the fire, her eyes wide with alarm. She had heard the hooves too, and she could see the change in Ayan's demeanor. She had heard him mention Silas's name before, but seeing the look on his face now told her everything she needed to know. The fear in his eyes wasn't just for himself. It was for her children. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice small, tremulous. Ayan didn't answer immediately. He turned back to her, his face grim, his jaw clenched. "It's Silas," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, the weight of the name hanging heavy in the room. "And I'm afraid he's come for you." Isabella's heart sank, her breath catching in her throat as she stood up quickly. She hadn't expected this. She thought that maybe, just maybe, they were safe, that they could finally rest. But the past was catching up to them, fast and hard. The door creaked open, and Ayan stepped outside, rifle in hand. The three riders were getting closer, their horses moving with purpose, but they weren't rushing. It was clear they weren't just arriving in haste. They were here with a plan. Silas, at the front, wore a gentleman's coat, his face smooth and calculating as always. But there was a coldness in his eyes, a glint that made Ayan's blood run cold. Silas was never one for pleasantries, especially when he wanted something. Behind him were two men, hired muscle by the looks of them, tall, broad-shouldered, and built for intimidation. They didn't carry themselves like ranchers or farmers. Their posture spoke of men who had seen violence and been part of it. Mr. Brennan, Silas's voice cut through the silence as he pulled his horse to a stop in front of the house. I trust I'm not interrupting anything too important. Ion said nothing, his eyes hardening as he stepped forward, positioning himself between Silas and the door. Isabella was still inside, just out of view, but he could feel her eyes on him. He couldn't afford to let Silas think for 1 second that he was in control. "You've got no business here, Hartwell," Ion said, his voice steady, his hand tightening around the rifle. Silas smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "On the contrary, I have every right to be here. My sister-in-law, as you know, has taken my brother's children. That's not something I take lightly, Brennan." He held up a piece of paper, the edges curled from handling. "I have legal documents, signed and sealed, stating that I'm their legal guardian. That makes you harboring fugitives, you know, and interfering with family matters." Ion's eyes flicked to the paper, then back to Silas. He had been expecting something like this, but it didn't change the fact that Silas was lying. There was no way Isabella was unfit. Silas had never cared about her well-being. He had always seen her as nothing more than a pawn in his game. "You're trespassing," Ion said, his voice low but firm. "You want to talk law? Then come back with the sheriff. Not today, not on Thanksgiving, and certainly not at my door." Silas's smile faded as he dismounted, his boots thudding against the earth with authority. "You're making a mistake, Brennan," he said softly, the tone turning darker. "I always get what's mine. Always." His eyes locked onto Ion's with an unsettling intensity. "I'd suggest you don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. I'm not here to start trouble. I just want what's rightfully mine." Ion felt a rush of anger course through him, but he didn't let it show. Silas's casual demeanor, his air of entitlement, made Ion want to lunge forward and knock him down. But he knew that wasn't the way to handle this. Silas wasn't just after the children. Ion knew that much, and it wasn't just about legal guardianship. This was personal. He had taken Mary from him, and now he wanted to take Isabella, to control everything she had left. "If you're here to take them, then you'll have to go through me," Ion said coldly, his hand never leaving the rifle. "You won't lay a hand on them. Not as long as I'm breathing." The air between them thickened, and for a moment, everything was still, the wind barely moving, the sky a deep cloudless blue. Silas's men stood behind him, watching the exchange with trained, expressionless faces. They were waiting for a signal, ready to act at a moment's notice. Silas's smile returned, though it was colder this time, and he took a step closer to Ion, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You know, I'm not like you, Brennan. I don't play by your rules. I don't wait for justice. I make my own. Ask my late brother." "Oh, wait, you can't." The words were like ice, and Ion's blood ran cold. Silas had just admitted it. He had killed his brother, had sabotaged the mine, had caused the accident that had taken Ion's family. And now, he wanted to take what he thought was his by right. Ion took a step forward, his chest tightening with rage, but he kept his cool. He wouldn't give Silas the satisfaction of showing fear. "Get off my property," Ion said firmly. "You're trespassing, and I won't let you use the law as an excuse to destroy everything that's left." Silas didn't move. "You think you can protect her?" he asked, his voice taunting. "You think you can stop me? You're just a rancher, Brennan, a man who's been hiding for 3 years. What are you really going to do?" The words cut through Ion like a knife. But he didn't flinch. "I've got enough to stop you," Ion said, his voice hard. "And I'll fight until the last breath if it means protecting her, the children, and this place." "We'll see about that," Silas replied, his voice growing darker. "This isn't over. I'll be back with the law or without it. Either way, those children are mine, and I always get what's mine." Ion didn't respond. He stood his ground, rifle still in hand, watching Silas as he mounted his horse again. "I'm not afraid of you," Ion said quietly. Silas's eyes glinted with malice, but he didn't speak again. He just turned his horse and, with a nod to his men, began to ride away. Ion watched them disappear into the distance, but he knew it wasn't over. He knew Silas wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. As the dust settled, Ion turned back toward the house. Inside, Isabella was waiting, her face pale but resolute. "He's gone," Ion said, his voice tight. "But I don't think this is over. He'll be back, and when he does, we'll be ready." Isabella nodded, though the fear never fully left her eyes. Ion could see it, but for now, he had bought them a little more time. And time, in this world, was all they needed. Nightfall came swiftly, cloaking the ranch in darkness, and Ion stood by the window, his eyes scanning the shadows as the wind howled outside. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like a storm about to break. The quiet of the evening had given way to the sound of hooves in the distance, and now it was as if the very land around them was holding its breath. Silas had left, but Ion knew better than to think they were truly safe. He could feel it deep in his bones. This was far from over. As he stood there, his thoughts racing, Isabella entered the room quietly, her eyes wide with concern. "What's happening?" she asked softly, glancing toward the window where Ion stood frozen. "They'll be back," he said quietly, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what was to come. "Silas won't give up. Not without a fight." Isabella's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, the fear she had been holding back bubbled to the surface. "What should we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the uncertainty clear in her tone. Ion turned to face her, his expression resolute. "We prepare, we wait, and when he comes back, we fight." The words sounded harder than he felt, but they were the truth. There was no running now. They had nowhere left to go. Outside, the sound of hooves grew louder, closer. Ion moved swiftly to the door, grabbing his rifle and checking the ammunition. His hand shook slightly, but he forced himself to steady it. He had been in this position before, back when the world felt safer, when he had a wife and son to protect. He wasn't sure if he could protect anyone now, but he would die trying. "Get the children to the cellar," Ion ordered, his voice firm but calm. "Make sure they stay quiet. Don't come out unless I tell you. Do you understand?" Isabella nodded quickly, her face pale but determined. "I understand," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that lingered in her eyes. She turned toward the children, who were still asleep, unaware of the danger approaching. Ion watched her for a moment, his heart heavy. He hated this, hated the fear in her eyes, hated that they had to live like this. But he couldn't afford to let his emotions get the best of him. Silas was coming, and he had to be ready. As Isabella hurried to the cellar with the children, Ion moved to the window again, his eyes narrowing as he saw the first of the torches flicker in the distance. They were coming. The riders had returned, and they were bringing the storm with them. Ion could see their figures in the distance, moving steadily toward the ranch, their horses galloping with purpose. He could make out the shape of Silas at the front, a dark figure against the dimming sky, and he could see the glint of the torches in their hands. They were preparing for something, a fight, perhaps, or a siege. Ion didn't know for sure, but he wasn't about to wait around and find out. He grabbed a second rifle from the wall, checking it quickly before stepping outside into the cold night air. The ground was hard beneath his boots, and the wind howled through the trees as he made his way to the barn. His eyes darted to the barn doors, and he saw that the horses were spooked, their ears flicking nervously at the sound of the approaching riders. The tension in the air was palpable, and Ion could feel his pulse quicken as he prepared for what was to come. He knew Silas wouldn't come quietly. This wasn't just about the children anymore. This was personal. As he reached the barn, he turned to face the house, taking one last look at the door where Isabella and the children were hidden. He hoped they would be safe in the cellar, but he couldn't be sure. Silas had men who would do anything to get what they wanted. And Ion knew, without a doubt, that they would stop at nothing to take Isabella and the children. He moved quickly, silently, securing the barn doors behind him as he took up position by one of the windows. He checked his rifle once more, his fingers steady as he looked out over the yard, watching the riders approach. The torches were getting closer now, and Ion knew it wouldn't be long before they arrived at the house. The wind whipped through the trees, but it did little to drown out the sound of the hoofbeats as they grew louder and louder. The siege was beginning. He could feel it. Inside the house, Isabella had reached the cellar with the children. She had tucked them into the far corner, where they would be as safe as possible, and now she stood at the top of the stairs, her hand resting on the railing as she listened to the sounds of the riders approaching. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mind raced with fear. She had thought they were safe here. She had hoped, foolishly, that they might find peace. But Silas had found them, and now she wasn't sure if they would survive the night. She couldn't shake the image of her children, so innocent, so vulnerable. She didn't want them to be dragged into this fight. She didn't want them to know the horrors that lay just beyond the door. But she knew, deep down, that they were already a part of it, a part of the danger that followed her wherever she went. She just prayed that Ion could keep them safe. She could hear the muffled sound of hooves outside now, and she turned to look at the children huddled together in the corner. Daniel was wide-eyed, his hand clutching the knife Ion had given him, while Sarah sat silently, her face pale but determined. Lily, still too young to understand, was asleep in Isabella's arms, her fever finally breaking. Isabella held her tighter, whispering a silent prayer as she waited for Ion's signal. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew they had no choice but to face it. She couldn't keep running. Not anymore. Ion's voice cut through the tension in the house. "Stay quiet," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Don't move unless I tell you. I'll be back soon." Isabella nodded, though she wasn't sure if he could see her. She moved back to the children, her heart heavy as she crouched beside them, her arms wrapping around them protectively. They were ready now, ready to fight, ready to protect each other. The riders were closing in, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they arrived at the door. She just hoped Ion would be enough. But as the first torchlight flickered outside, she felt a chill run down her spine. The storm was here. The siege had begun. The night air grew colder as the tension in the house escalated, and Ion's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched by the barn window, rifle poised, eyes trained on the approaching riders. The torches flickered like ghostly beacons, casting long shadows across the yard, and Ion knew they were nearing the final moment of this deadly standoff. Silas Hartwell, along with his hired men, was now just steps away from breaking down the fragile peace Ion had fought so hard to protect. He could feel the weight of the rifle in his hands, the familiar weight of responsibility and the silent promise he had made to himself and to Isabella. He wouldn't let them take her or the children, not while he still had breath in his lungs. The sounds of hoofbeats grew louder, closer, and Ion's senses sharpened. His pulse quickened as his eyes flicked from the riders to the barn door, scanning for movement, for any sign of an impending breach. The shadows outside danced and shifted, and though he could barely make out the figures of Silas's men, the malicious intent was palpable in the air. Every step they took toward the house felt like a drumbeat in his chest. As Ion steeled himself for what was to come, he thought of Isabella and the children, tucked safely in the cellar. He thought of the fragile peace they had found, and the hope he had dared to feel when they had first stepped inside his home. But that hope now felt like a distant memory. Outside, the air was thick with the promise of violence. He knew this moment would be decisive. If Silas and his men came for them, it would not be an easy fight. Ion was not a man to back down, but he was also no fool. He had to be strategic. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Every muscle in his body was tense as he waited. It felt like the world had slowed, and his thoughts had narrowed to a single point. The safety of the people he had come to care for, the lives of the children who had been through so much, and Isabella the woman who had fought to protect them all. The sound of a horse snorting from outside snapped Ayan back to reality, and his breath caught in his throat. The riders were here. He could hear them now, the gravel beneath their horses' hooves crunching in the distance. He couldn't see their faces, but the figure in front, Silas, stood out like a shadow against the dark sky, his coat flapping in the wind like a banner of command. Ayan took a deep breath, his finger resting lightly on the trigger as he held his position. He wasn't afraid of Silas. He had spent enough time in this world of violence to know what it meant to stand his ground. What he was afraid of, though, was what would happen to Isabella and the children if he wasn't enough. He needed to do this. He had to protect them. The riders came closer, and Ayan's gaze never left them. He could hear the muffled sounds of their voices, low and menacing, but there was no turning back now. He had made a choice, and he had made it with conviction. As the riders pulled up to the barn, Ayan took one final look at the house before stepping into the shadows, keeping his rifle raised. He knew what he had to do. Isabella and the children were depending on him. Silas didn't stop when he reached the barn. He dismounted with a slow, deliberate motion, his eyes scanning the surroundings, no doubt trying to assess how many people were waiting for him. He wasn't here for pleasantries. He was here for control. Ayan could hear him barking orders to his men, and though the words were muffled, the intent was clear. They were about to make their move. "I know you're out there, Brennan." Silas's voice rang out, loud enough for Ayan to hear, and it sent a chill down his spine. "I've come for what's mine. I suggest you step out and make this easy. I don't want to hurt anyone." Ayan's lips curled into a hard smile, but he didn't show himself yet. "You don't get to take anything from me, Hartwell," he called back, his voice calm, steady. "You've already taken enough. You won't take them too." Silas's response was a low chuckle, one that lacked any humor. "You really think you can stop me?" he called, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just a rancher. You think you can protect them? You're not even their blood. And if you think you can stop me with a rifle, you've got another thing coming. My men are here, and we have the law on our side." Ayan gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on the rifle as he adjusted his position. Silas was trying to goad him, trying to make him make a mistake. He wasn't going to fall for it. He had fought too hard for this. He had too much to lose now. "If you want them, you'll have to go through me first," Ayan said, his voice sharp, unwavering. "I've fought for everything I have. You'll find I'm not an easy man to kill." There was a brief silence, and then Silas's voice came again, this time with a threat. "Don't say I didn't warn you, Brennan, but you'll see. You'll regret standing in my way." The tension in the air was thick now, unbearable. Ayan could feel his heart beating faster as he watched Silas and his men circle the barn, their eyes scanning for any sign of movement. But Ayan was patient. He would wait until the moment was right. Then he would make his move. As the minutes ticked by, the sounds outside became more pronounced. The wind howled, and the flicker of torches cast long shadows across the yard. Ayan's senses were on high alert, every nerve focused on the men outside. He couldn't let his guard down. Not now. And then the sound came. A gunshot, loud and sudden, broke the silence, and Ayan's heart raced. It was a warning shot, meant to draw him out. But Ayan didn't flinch. He stayed hidden, his rifle steady in his hands. Silas's voice followed, cutting through the night like a blade. "Last chance, Brennan. Come out now, and maybe I'll let you walk away. I'm not in the mood for a fight, but if you force my hand, you'll regret it." Ayan knew Silas was testing him, try to break him. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, but he refused to let fear take hold. He had fought too hard to protect what little he had left. He wasn't going to let Silas take it away. And with that, he stepped out of the barn, his rifle raised, his gaze locked on Silas and his men. "I'm not going anywhere, Hartwell," Ayan said, his voice filled with determination. "You want them, you'll have to go through me." The confrontation had begun. Ayan could feel the weight of the moment, the lives of Isabella and the children resting on the decisions made in the next few moments. But he was ready. He would do whatever it took to protect them, even if it meant facing Silas down to the very end. The sun had barely begun to rise when the first shots were fired, shattering the fragile peace that had settled over Ayan's ranch. And with each passing minute, the sound of gunfire grew louder, more insistent. Ayan's heart was a drumbeat in his chest, steady and sure, as he crouched low to the ground, his eyes flicking from Silas's men to the barn door, which was their only means of escape. He had prepared for this moment, this reckoning, but he hadn't expected it to feel so overwhelming, so all-consuming. His fingers were tense on the rifle, his breath shallow, as he watched Silas's men fan out across the yard, their eyes sharp, their rifles raised. The siege had begun. He could hear Isabella's voice in his head, soft and fearful, urging him to be careful, to protect the children, but it was hard to focus on anything other than the men outside, the men who had come to take everything he had worked so hard to protect. The danger wasn't just real, it was closing in on them fast. Ayan glanced back at the house, his thoughts briefly drifting to Isabella and the children. They were safe for now, hidden in the cellar, but he knew the longer they stayed in hiding, the more likely it was that Silas would find them. Ayan had promised he would keep them safe, but the weight of that promise was beginning to feel unbearable. The shots rang out again, closer this time, and Ayan's muscles tensed in response. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and there was no turning back. His body was a bundle of nerves, but his mind was clear, focused on the task at hand. He had trained for moments like this, moments when everything was on the line, moments when his instincts and his will to protect would be the only things standing between survival and defeat. He wasn't going to lose them. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. Now when they were so close to finding peace. Silas's voice cut through the chaos, calm and commanding. "Come out, Brennan," he shouted, his words carrying across the yard. "This doesn't have to be difficult. Just send the children out and we'll leave. No one else has to get hurt." Ayan clenched his teeth, feeling the burn of rage rise up within him. Silas's cold, calculating tone was as familiar as it was infuriating. He had heard that voice before. The voice of a man who thought he could control everything, who thought he could manipulate people into submission with just a few words. But Ayan wasn't going to let him win. He wasn't going to let Silas have what he wanted. He wasn't going to let him take Isabella, or the children, or anything else. The wind howled through the trees, whipping the dust across the yard in wild, erratic bursts. Ayan's eyes darted across the landscape, searching for any sign of weakness in Silas's position, any chance to take them by surprise. But there was none. Silas had men in place, positioned to cover every angle. And Ayan knew that if he made a move now, if he revealed his position, the fight would be over before it had even begun. But what choice did he have? He couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't let Silas get any closer to Isabella or the children. They were his responsibility now, and Ayan would do whatever it took to protect them. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs as he steeled himself for the battle ahead. He glanced once more at the barn, his mind calculating the best possible route to take, the quickest way to get to the children if things went south. Isabella's face flashed in his mind, her eyes full of fear and gratitude, and he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had promised her safety, but now, as the first shots rang out, he couldn't help but wonder if he was leading them all into a trap. "Ayan," Silas shouted again, his voice taunting. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing but a man hiding behind a rifle. You're just delaying the inevitable. Come out now, and maybe I'll let you walk away." Maybe. Ayan's grip tightened on the rifle, his anger surging like a wave. Silas had always underestimated him, always thought he could bully his way through any situation. But Ayan wasn't the same man he had been before. He wasn't the quiet, broken man who had lost everything. He had something to fight for now. He had Isabella, the children, the land he had worked so hard to build, and he wasn't about to let Silas take it from him. He turned to the side, sliding into position behind a stack of hay bales, his heart pounding as he checked his rifle one last time. He knew this was a risk, but it was the only chance he had. He had to make his move before Silas did. With a final glance back at the house, Ayan stepped out from his cover, rifle raised, and aimed directly at Silas. He could see the surprise flicker across Silas's face, his confidence faltering for just a second as Ayan leveled the rifle at him. But Silas quickly recovered, his smile returning, though it was colder than ever. "You're making a mistake," Silas called out. "You're not going to win this fight, Brennan. You're just a man with a rifle. You can't stop me." Ayan's finger hovered over the trigger, his eyes locked on Silas, his heart steady. "I'm not trying to win," Ayan replied, his voice low and controlled. "I'm trying to keep them safe, and I'll die before I let you take them." The words hung in the air for a moment before Ayan fired, the sound of the rifle echoing across the yard, sharp and loud. But Silas was quick. He ducked to the side, narrowly avoiding the shot, and Ayan cursed under his breath. He had to get closer. He couldn't let Silas escape. The riders were closing in now, their guns drawn, and Ayan knew it was only a matter of time before they overwhelmed him. But he didn't care. He would fight to the end. As the men charged forward, Ayan took another shot, this one hitting its mark, and one of Silas's men went down. The rest of the group scattered, seeking cover, but Ayan stayed focused on Silas, his eyes never leaving him. The battle had begun in earnest now, and Ayan wasn't backing down. He had made his choice, and it was the only one he could make. He would fight for them. He would fight until his last breath if it meant protecting Isabella, the children, and the life they had found together. The storm had come, and now it was time to face it head on. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow across the land as Ayan sat on the porch, his gaze lingering on the distant horizon. The air was still, the kind of quiet that only comes after a storm has passed, when everything seems to be holding its breath. Isabella came outside, her presence soft but strong, and sat next to him, her hand brushing against his in a small but significant gesture. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The weight of the past few days hung between them, but so did something else, something lighter, something that felt like hope, even after everything they had been through. Ayan turned to look at her, the lines of tension in his face finally starting to relax. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice filled with a kind of disbelief. "It's really over." Isabella nodded, her eyes soft as she glanced toward the children, who were playing in the yard, their laughter a sweet sound that made Ayan's heart ache with something close to joy. They had made it through. After all the violence, all the fear, they had survived. Silas was gone, arrested, and the threat that had followed them for so long had finally been dealt with. The barn, though damaged, had been repaired, and the house had weathered the siege without a scratch. There was still work to be done, still fences to fix and fields to tend to, but for the first time in a long time, Ayan didn't feel that gnawing emptiness inside him. He felt something else, something that had been buried deep beneath grief and loss, something that was finally starting to bloom. "You did it," Isabella said, her voice gentle as she looked at him with admiration. "You saved us." Ayan shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We save each other," he said softly. He had never imagined this life for himself, never imagined opening his door to a woman and children in need, never imagined the possibility of healing from the wounds that had kept him locked in the past. But here they were, together, in this house, this home they had built out of nothing but need and determination. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it was real. It was theirs. He glanced toward the barn again, where Daniel and Sarah were helping him feed the horses, and his chest tightened with emotion. Daniel was becoming a young man before his eyes, learning the ways of the land with an eagerness that reminded Ayan of his own youth. Sarah, too, had found her voice again, her silence slowly fading as she bonded with him and Isabella. And Lily, little Lily, who had started calling him Papa in her soft, unsteady way, was growing stronger every day. She had been a reminder of what was at stake, and now she was a living, breathing testament to their resilience. Ion turned his gaze to Isabella, his heart full. "Thank you," he whispered, the words simple but heavy with meaning. She looked at him, her eyes warm with affection, and squeezed his hand. "I'm the one who should be thanking you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave us a chance when I thought we had none." He shook his head again, his heart swelling. "I didn't give you a chance," he replied, his voice firm. "You gave me one." He paused, looking out over the land that stretched before them, the land that was now theirs. "I never thought I'd be here," he said, his voice soft with wonder. "After everything I've lost, I thought that was it for me, that I was just done. But now, with you and the children, I feel like I've got a second chance. A real chance." Isabella smiled, her fingers brushing against his. "It's not just a second chance for you," she said, her voice warm. "It's a second chance for all of us." And in that moment, Ion understood. He understood that family wasn't just about blood. It was about the people who chose to stand by you, the people who chose to stay no matter what. And here, on this land, with Isabella and the children, he had found a family. It was a family born not from law or inheritance, but from choice and love. The house, the barn, the land, they were all symbols of the life they were building together, a life Ion had never thought possible. A life he was finally ready to live. "We're a family," he said, the words settling into his heart. Isabella looked at him, her eyes shining with something deep and unspoken. "We are," she said softly, "and we always will be." As the evening wore on, they sat together on the porch, watching the children play in the yard, the sounds of their laughter filling the air. It was the first real peace Ion had known in years, and he could feel the weight of it settling into his bones, a balm to the scars that had festered for so long. He didn't know what the future would bring. He couldn't predict it, and he wasn't foolish enough to think it would be easy. But he knew this: they had survived. They had fought for their place in this world, and now they had it. He looked at Isabella again, his gaze lingering on her face, the lines of worry slowly fading as she relaxed beside him. She had come to him in desperation, with nothing but her children and a secret past. Now, she was his partner, his equal, and the mother of his children. He couldn't imagine a future without her. "I think we should celebrate," he said, his voice light with a smile. "Thanksgiving isn't over yet." Isabella chuckled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "A celebration, huh? What did you have in mind?" Ion grinned, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "How about a feast?" he said. "A real feast. One with everything we've got." And so they did. That evening, as the sun sank low in the sky, they gathered around the table, the food piled high with all the fixings Ion had worked hard to prepare, and they shared a meal together, a meal that felt like the beginning of something new. The storm had passed, and in its wake, they had found something more precious than gold. They had found home. And as they ate, as they laughed, and as they shared their first Thanksgiving together as a family, Ion realized that no matter what had come before, this was the moment that truly mattered. This was the life they had chosen, and nothing, no one, could take it away from them. As they sat together, Ion took Isabella's hand in his, feeling the warmth of her touch, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly believe that everything they had fought for was worth it. This was just the beginning. The family they had become, the love they had found, it was real, and it was theirs to keep.